Is this what people mean when they say razor language? Hello, and welcome to my official apology to Razor. I have ignored you for far too long. Okay, so to preface, I think it was about 3 months ago now when the Hex units received their buffs, where you guys know by now, a set selection of units were given the Hexerai character tag and also gained extra effects in their kit when you obtained the Hexerai Secret Right effect, which that's obtained just by putting 2 Hexerai characters in the same team. Some of the buffed units were like Fischl and Sucrose, already fairly strong characters that didn't really need extra stuff within their kit, but these Hex buffs gave them extra use cases and gave them more incentive to run with other Hex teammates. And then there were units like Venti and Albedo who weren't particularly useful before the Hex buffs and got massive overhauls. But of course, the less useful versions of their kits still remain if you don't play them in double Hex teams. The first category were already particularly good units that got Hexerai incentives, and the second category were much worse units that got much better but were given Hexerai requirements. Razor was a particularly weak unit before his Hexerai buffs, so you'd think that he'd be in the latter category, but for some reason, he's not. Yeah, for some reason, Hoyo decided to make Razor a Hex unit and decided to give him a ton of buffs, but unlike the other units who have Hex restrictions, Razor was given most of his buffs to his base kit, and they don't require a second Hexerai unit. To explain what I'm talking about, I'm going to give a quick overview of Razor's kit, because I assume you guys aren't overly familiar with what he does. Even though the Hex buffs made him much better, it seems like people still don't really play a lot of Razor. Before we get into that, I want to point out 2 things. Number 1, there is 1 passive within his entire kit that is double Hex locked. Every other buff that he got is base kit. As long as you do the Witch's homework, Razor will have everything else in his kit permanently. And this passive, I'm gonna go over the exact effects a little bit later because it needs more context, but this passive, the only Hex passive within his kit, does a lot less than you probably think it would. And the second thing that I need to mention, while he isn't Hex locked, he definitely is still heavily reliant on his C6. He's completely functional without his C6, there's nothing that it does to actually change your gameplay, but his C6 gives him so many stats that I wouldn't really recommend playing Razor before it. But lucky you, Razor's in the next month's Star Glitter shop rotation, so you can pick him up there, and hopefully Hoyo will decide to start putting him on banners sometime soon. Like, I don't know why we buffed him, and now we're just not letting him out of the dungeon. Maybe it's because he's too good. Maybe it's because he's too flexible. Surely that's it. Anyways, base kit. His normal attack is a very important talent, as his normals make up a large portion of his own personal damage. It's a pretty standard 4-hit normal attack combo, with the only notable thing being the last hit, like many other last hits in normal attack combos, is too slow to really consider doing. In most of his optimal combos, you're going to be doing N3 spam. 3 normal attacks and then canceling out of the 4th with a dash or a skill. Speaking of which, the skill. His skill is your standard hit of electro damage. Multiplier isn't too bad, it's definitely betrayed by my low talent levels here, but it has an additional effect when hitting an enemy. Upon dealing damage, you'll gain an Electro Sigil. At a baseline, you'll only get 1, but one of the new changes to his C6 is that it increases that 1 sigil to 3, and this is one of the buffs to his base kit that happens regardless whether you have a second Hex unit in the team or not. Razor's the only character in the party, I do my E, and I still get 3 sigils when it hits. So anyways, what do these sigils even do? Passively, while they're hovering behind Razor, they'll give him an energy recharge buff, 20% per sigil. Once Razor's at C6, it's very easy to have permanent uptime on all 3 sigils, which effectively means Razor just gets a passive 60% energy, which is kind of a lot. He does have a fairly high energy cost burst at 80, but this passive 60 energy regen combined with a few other things in his kit make his energy needs pretty easy to meet. But these sigils don't stop at giving Razor a passive 60% ER buff pretty much all the time. They can also be consumed to give him 5 flat energy per sigil. Now, there are 2 methods of consuming sigils, and the first method is the alternate casting method for this skill. Instead of tapping, you hold, and Razor does an AoE attack that deals a little bit more damage and consumes the electro sigils, giving him some flat energy. We'll get into the details about when you should be using your tap versus your hold skill a little bit later, but in general, you can kind of just stay away from hold skill. It's pretty rare that it's going to be more useful than the tap version of his skill. Yes, it does more damage, and yes, it can give you some nice extra energy generation with the flat energy that your sigils give you, but it having a longer animation, a longer cooldown, and it consuming the electro sigils and making you lose your 60% ER buff makes it so it's not all that useful and is usually on par or worse than your press skill. Now, the second way of consuming electro sigils, which is generally the method that you want to be using, is his burst. Simply by using his burst, he will consume his electro sigils and get the energy that they give him. Okay, his burst obviously does more than just consuming electro sigils, so what the hell else is going on here? His burst is his main tool for doing damage. Its main two effects being that it massively increases Razor's attack speed, and it gives him coordinated electro attacks along with his physical normals. And no, this attack speed buff still does not make N4 worth using. His burst also does a bunch of other wild things, such as increasing his resistance to electro damage, making him immune to electro charge damage, although that was pretty standard fare in early game Genshin. It disables his charged attacks, so he's only able to do normals. He's not able to do his big spinnies. It increases his interruption resist, and something very funny that the game doesn't even bother to tell you is that Razor applies electro to himself. You can see it on the HUD, you can see it when I use my elemental vision. He's purple. That property is actually used in teams like Thundering Fury when you play Razor on field with Bennett, because Bennett also applies pyro to your on-fielder, and you can use the fact that they both continually apply elements to your on-field character to trigger overloads on Razor and deal extra damage to enemies. But also this property can be used against you because it enables enemies to trigger reactions on your characters. Like for example here with the hamster, he leaves these pyro marks on the ground, and if you walk into them with Razor Burst, you'll overload and take damage. Can you tell I've been playing this Abyss a little bit too much? Anyways, one final thing that Razor's Burst does but doesn't bother telling you about, it gives Razor another animation for his skill. We can see the regular tap skill, he does this little kind of flip forward jump, while using his skill during his burst makes him do a much more powerful looking front flip. As far as I know, his burst skill and his regular skill are almost entirely identical aside from the animation. They're around the same speed. The burst hitbox's skill might be a little bit larger, but it's not much larger. And it doesn't get any sort of new multipliers, it just uses the same ones that are in his skill. For some reason, I neglected to mention the one big difference between Razor's skill in and outside of his burst, which is that while in his burst, his skill doesn't generate any energy particles. It does generate the electro sigils, so this actually brings us on to our first use for his hold skill. Because Razor doesn't have any normal ways to generate particles while in his burst, what you can do if you're just short of meeting your burst costs, you can instead use your hold skill to consume your sigils and give yourself energy that way. Now, this is just one of the ways that you can help meet Razor's energy needs. I'm going to mention a few more later, but keep that in mind. If you're just short of meeting your burst costs, instead of doing tap skills, you can use his hold skill to give yourself 15 flat energy immediately. In any case, final thing about his burst, it not only incentivizes you leveling your normals by giving you a bunch of attack speed, but actually if we look, the coordinated electro attack damage doesn't have its own multiplier, and it takes from your normal attack multipliers and applies a modifier to them. So right now, at talent level 9, each coordinated electro attack will deal 40.8% of whatever normal attack was used to trigger it. Also, the normal attack speed bonus caps out at 40% when you have it at talent level 10. I wouldn't recommend crowning this skill to get the attack speed. I would just wait until you have the constellation that lets you hit this attack speed threshold without having to crown it. Now on to his ascension passives, which are thankfully pretty simple. A1 resets the cooldown of his skill upon using his burst and also decreases its base cooldown by 18%. This actually isn't a bad ascension talent at all. With that reset, he's allowed to use his skill to get the initial 3 particles, use his burst to get the flat energy from those 3 sigils, and then immediately use his skill again and get right back up to 3 sigils. His skill is also just a not bad motion value at all, especially in Hexarai teams. You want to be using your skill as soon as it's off cooldown. Why is that? I'll get into it. His skill deals a good amount of damage, it's something you want to be casting a lot of the time, and this passive just lets him get better sigil generation and lets him deal more damage with the skill. And then A4, basically does nothing at all. When he's below 50% energy, he gets 30% more energy recharge. With how much flat energy Razor can give himself, he's generally not below 50% energy for very long, so this 30% extra energy almost never comes into effect on Razor. He refunds so much of his own burst cost that this passive nearly never comes into play. When it's active, and it gives him an extra 30% energy recharge, but generally this talent doesn't really mean anything at all. And if you're looking at the screen right now, you might be thinking, well, you're done with active talents and you're done with passive talents, so that's it for Razor's base kit, right? Wrong. Within Razor's Hexarai talent, he does have a small passive effect that is locked behind Hexarai's secret right, but before that is listed a small buff that he gets access to permanently as long as he's done his witch's homework. Razor's Elemental Burst Lightning Fang is enhanced. The Wolf Within's damage dealt is increased by 70% of Razor's attack. That is of course talking about the coordinated electro damage attached to his burst. 70% is definitely not the biggest increase in the world, but considering how much Razor hits with this electro coordinated attack, he can hit upwards of 10 times in a rotation, that adds up to 700% motion value that Razor just didn't have before, and it's completely free. It doesn't require you to put a second hex unit in your team. Before we talk about this passive, I want to look at his constellations, because additionally, everything that he got in his constellations is also base kit and doesn't need a hex unit. His early cons are pretty simple increases. C1 gives him damage bonus when he picks up particles. C2 increases his crit rate against low health opponents. C4 decreases def, which is actually kind of important. I always have to say, defense and elemental resistance are two separate stats. Defense is an entirely different stat, and it reduces almost all incoming damage that an enemy takes. So having a defense shredder on your team will make everybody deal a significant amount more damage. Not only does this increase Razor's own damage, but his best teams often have other damage dealers like Fischl and Durin, and their damage will also be increased by this defense shred. I'd actually say that Razor is kind of a usable on-field supportive option at C4. Still, most of his effects are locked behind C6, so I would really hesitate on trying to use him before then, but C4 does give him a bit more of a reason to be used. Anyways, C6, the basic effect is that once every 10 seconds, Razor would get an additional coordinated attack on his normal attacks, dealing 100% of his attack as electro damage. This lightning strike also gives him 3 electro sigils as long as he's not in his burst state. That part doesn't really matter all that much, but it's kind of cool, I guess. I already talked about this additional effect. Instead of gaining 1 sigil through his skill, he gains 3. I mentioned that extra sigil generation is nice for Razor's energy needs, but once we look at his hex passive, we'll realize that the main purpose of his skill granting 3 electro sigils was to get his hex passive online better. In any case, not horribly important. It's mostly a quality of life thing if you're not playing him in a Hexarai team. The secondary effect is much more important. For 15 seconds after consuming Electro Sigils, Razor's crit rate is increased by 10% and crit damage is increased by 50%. He just gets a bunch of crit stats for free. His burst automatically consumes Electro Sigils, so as long as you use your skill before using your burst, you will get a free 70% crit value. And I hate to keep repeating myself, but everything that we have gone over is newly added to his base kit. You do not require a second Hexarai to get these effects. And here's where we come across a second use for his hold skill. While the intended design for Razor is that you consume the Electro Sigils with your burst and get your crit buff through that doesn't always happen. Razor's skill has a bit of a wonky hitbox, and it occasionally can miss enemies completely, and in that case, using his burst won't consume any sigils and it won't give him any crit buff. So his hold skill can kind of be used as a recovery move to get your crit buff when you want it, because as you can see, use my hold skill, I've consumed my sigils, and I get my crit buff. You can either use this to fix a flubbed rotation, like I was just showing, or alternatively, it's a really nice way of getting his crit buff in Overworld if you don't want to waste his big 80 cost burst. These hex buffs have added to Razor's base kit a pretty decent amount of extra motion value on his burst, a little bit of extra energy, and a ridiculous amount of crit stats. He has become a much better DPS in a wide variety of teams that do not require you to have a second Hexarai unit. I can't get over how cool I think this is. Why was Razor the one to receive all these buffs to his base kit while everybody else all had their hex requirements? I have no idea, but I'm not going to ask too many questions because I don't want Hoyo to take this away from me. The majority of Razor's buffs are not hex requirement, they are only homework required. Now let's jump back to his Hexarai passive to look at the only thing that Razor gets by including a second Hexarai unit in his teams. While the Wolf Within, summoned by Razor's Elemental Burst Lightning Fang, is active, if the Electro Sigils from Razor's Elemental skill Claw and Thunder overflow, the Wolf Within will call down a Lightning Strike on nearby enemies, dealing 150% of Razor's attack and restoring 7 energy. This effect can be triggered once every 1 second. Compared to all the other buffs that he's got, this is kind of tiny. It's a little bit of extra damage, which Razor already got plenty of from his buffs, and a little bit of extra energy, which Razor already had plenty of. Okay, I don't think I explained why his Hex passive was such a minimal increase. When you're in your burst and you overflow on sigils, you'll get a little bit of extra damage and energy. So let's just see how it plays out in game. Use your skill, burst consumes sigil, I'm back to 0. I use my first skill to generate 3 sigils. Do some normals, wait for my skill to come offline, but on my second skill, I'll proc that overflow and get the damage and the energy. Do some more normals, do a third skill, then my burst runs out. So, across a normal rotation, I procced this effect 2 times. That's 300% multiplier and 14 energy. I basically just got 1 free out of burst skill cast. 300% scaling and 14 energy are just not all that much. You can use the effects of Thundering Fury to reduce his cooldown and get out more skills, and as I mentioned, his skill just has a pretty good multiplier attached to it, so this can be worth it. But Thundering Fury doesn't give good damaging stats, so essentially you're sacrificing your artifact damaging stats to get more damaging stats from your kit. It kind of breaks even. In my eyes, Razor is far from Hex-locked, and he's much closer to units like Durin, Varka, Fischl, and Sucrose, who only have Hex incentives and can be used perfectly fine on their own. Even the Hex artifact set is kind enough to work outside of double Hex teams. It just needs to be equipped to a character who completed a witch's homework. So yeah, this is my big realization about Razor, and I admit I feel a little bit stupid for ignoring him. The fact that most of Razor's Hex buffs don't require you to have a second Hex unit in your team opens up the door for so many goofy and stupid things to be done with him. By time of recording this, I've already done 1 Razor stream, and I would really love to do more once I get more investment in him, but as you can see right now, my talents are just not looking the best. I can do a few showcases of some of the goofier teams that I was looking at, but the main purpose of this video is me putting up the alarm and shouting to the heavens, hey everybody, Razor doesn't need a second Hex teammate. Why'd they decide to give the type of buff that makes them a much more useful universal unit to the 4-star and none of the 5 stars? I have no idea, but I'm not going to complain about it too much, at least from Razor's perspective. I am still going to complain about Albedo and Venti. For this showcase, I'm going to be using my level 81 Razor. Of course, he's C6. Talents are 7, 3, 6. Pretty miserable. Definite room for improvement. For his artifacts, I stole Varka's artifacts, and for his weapon, I stole Varka's weapon. Hex set is just a good damaging set on him. He does have other options in, like, Thundering Fury is technically a decent option, but the new Hex set gives so many stats that this should be your primary consideration. I currently have him on an attack goblet because he's a unit who deals multiple different types of damage. A lot of his buffs were specifically to his electro damage, and he got a lot more electro motion value. So electro damage goblets are actually fairly strong on him, but me personally, I like running physical Razor and I like running different types of infusion Razor, so I like to run an attack goblet so I can see bigger numbers out of his normal attacks. Serpent Spine is Serpent Spine, one of the best stat sticks to ever do it, but any attack percent stat stick can work just fine on him. Tidal Shadow is nice if you can meet its passive. Black Cliff exists if you don't have any other options. Both of the standard claymores work fairly well. Additionally, I have found a few teams where his energy needs aren't always perfectly met, and in those teams you can definitely use different options like the Fav weapons. If you have the Melazine sword, that works. If you have Flameforged Insight and can get use out of that. Razor is still fairly good on reaction spam teams because he applies a decent amount of his element. He applies Electro to himself and can cheat out more reactions that way. He doesn't get an infusion, he gets coordinated attacks, so you can give him an external infusion and then get more reactions that way. Can you guys tell that I like this Razor? Razor just randomly jumped up to being one of the most interesting units in the game to me once I figured out how his kit actually works. 5-star stat sticks are all 5-star stat sticks. They all work fairly well, and I think most people know by this point that Varka's Sig is Razor's new best weapon. Although Varka's weapon does come with the caveat that to be particularly good, it is hex restricted. Part of its buff is locked behind having 2 hex units. Putting it on Razor will then make Razor a little bit more hex locked. It's going to incentivize you to play him in more hex teams. It's definitely a good option if you have it. The only thing I would say is look out and make sure not to overcap, because between the 20% that he gets from his set and the 10% that he gets from C6, it actually does become kind of easy to overcap on Razor, especially if you're doing a cryo team, which is one of the things I first want to test. This was the first team that I looked at on the aforementioned Razor stream. It's not good. I am not going to pretend that it is really good, but it's definitely a lot better than you probably expect out of this team. Of course, it's using Chongyun to give Razor a cryo infusion, and then Shenhe to buff him further, and then Iansan is able to come in and be an attack buffer that doesn't mess with Chongyun's infusion, who is also able to hold scroll and buff both types of damage that Razor's doing. I'd actually like to take a second to talk about Iansan, because my account, I don't have very many Natlin units, and Iansan does not get much chance to be used. But I feel like with this discovery that Razor doesn't need a second hex unit, that Iansan has become a whole lot more useful to me. Not only does she do the things that I previously mentioned that are good for this team, but also she's an Electro unit. Razor definitely does have energy issues, but they can be solved basically by one of two things. Either by putting a second hex unit in the team and making use of this passive to give him some flat energy, or just by including a second Electro unit. Not only do they give you their own particles, but Electro Resonance is crazy powerful and gives you a bunch of extra particles. As long as you have either a hex unit or a second Electro, Razor's ER needs are pretty firmly met at any amount of ER. Looking at his base amount of ER, oh, it's 135, but that's actually wrong. This is one of the rare situations where I'm below 50% energy, so that 30% passive is kicking in. But if we get above 50% energy, and then we let our sigils expire, or we consume them, I only have 1 ER roll on this build, and I very rarely have issues with energy. Now let's do a rotation.
Transfiguration. Cryoing. Quick as a flash. Start the force. My blade. Spirit blade.
Certainly not the most powerful team in the world. In fact, I might go so far as to call this a bit of a bad team. The reason I am so obsessed with this team is the current Abyss. Second half having some heavy cryo incentives along with a massive normal attack cryo damage bonus buff is enough to make the team perform surprisingly well, that with enough investment, I think that I will be able to make this team clear second half of Abyss before Abyss rotates. And for anyone wondering about Night Soul generation, Razor, he's definitely not the best at it, but he's surprisingly good. He uses dash cancels to get out of doing his 4th normal attack, and he uses dash cancels to cancel the end lag on his skills. So he ends up moving around a fair bit and maintains relatively high Night Soul. And also a reminder that Iansan going below her Night Soul point threshold doesn't mean she stops buffing attack. It just means that she buffs less attack. So you don't have to have perfect Night Soul generation to use Iansan.
Take your true form. Cryo incarnate. Quick as a flash. Let's force. My blade.
You can see that the overall DPS, definitely not very good at all. But considering the vast majority of the team's damage is coming from Razor, it has more to gain from him being further invested in.
Swift and merciful. Controlled breathing. On my spirit blade. Get back.
I think I'm actually gonna find a different DPS dummy because I don't like this one's UI. Oh my god, you can get a DPS graph on this one? This one's awesome. I'm gonna use this one.
Cryo incarnate. Step aside. On force. My blade. From whence you
Yeah, I feel like a visual graph illustrates my point a lot better. I was also pushing 40k with good enough play, so this definitely has room for improvement. Is this a particularly good team that I'm trying to recommend? No. I'm just trying to find teams that use all of these generic damage stats that Razor got in interesting ways. His cryo normal attacks are still getting the insane crit buff given by his C6. He's still getting that additional energy regen and that additional motion value on his burst. We have an Abyss that heavily incentivizes cryo normal attacks, and Razor is able to get these cryo normal attacks while also utilizing all these other crazy buffs that are in his kit. It's just cool. It's just neat. It's not a team I'm trying to recommend, but it's telling how powerful the Razor buffs are that I can even consider a team like Razor, Chongyun, Shenhe, Iansan, and that team has a decent chance at being able to clear the current Abyss. Now that I'm done pitching this fever dream nightmare of a team, let's try another one. I feel like I'm legally required to do at least one overvape team every video. Fun thing this team, Inefa is far from necessary, and in fact, Fischl might be better. In this team, you're triggering both overloads and electro charges, so you're getting both of Fischl's buffs active, and you can snapshot Oz. And of course, she's a second Hex unit, and she activates Razor's own Hex passive, and that makes him a little bit better. But this video is about how Razor doesn't need Hex, so we're using Inefa for now.
Everybody stand. Get back.
Oh my god. Yeah, look at this. If anyone ever tells you Razor has high ER needs, just look in their face and call them a liar. This is also a team where you're getting a fair amount of transformative reaction damage out of Razor. I already mentioned a few reasons about why he is so good at reaction spam, and all of those reasons apply to this team. This one is a little bit more centered around buffing Razor, but there are plenty of teams that just do reactions that you can throw Razor in, and him getting extra reactions will just be a nice extra bonus. Like, for example, this is a team that I looked at, and there isn't really much that this team does for Razor. It's a lunar crystallized team where Razor is hanging off to the side, and again, Albedo is a Hex unit, but you can easily use Chiori here. Albedo's just going to make it a bit better by nature of dealing about the same damage as Chiori, while also activating Hex for Razor and buffing Razor. This is probably going to be the last team that I look at for now. Again, Pyro Traveler can be replaced by Durin, and this will be a much better team because Durin is a far better unit and also a Hex unit, but that's against the point of the video, so we're gonna play with a more free-to-play version of this. I'm gonna start off my rotation with a Razor E so I can get both Electro and Dendro and get them both on scroll. Get him, Emily.
Reconstitute.
Get him. It's an overburnt team. Razor is able to get a few overloads and potentially a few aggravates, while also using his normals to reapply Pyro for Emily, and I guess also himself to react off of.
Neutralize. I'm going in. Get back. Fresh and floral. Reconstitute. Teamwork is true. Extract.
Alright, I feel like that's where we're gonna end things. Not much of a showcase video, I just want to share all my findings. Razor is a non-Hex reliant DPS that just got a bunch of numerical buffs that he is able to utilize in any team that he's played in, that has a bunch of extra properties that make him particularly good at doing reaction spam. Yes, he has a best team of Bennett, Fischl, Chevy, but just like Varka, he has so much more beyond that to offer with the flexibility that he allows. I've I've sort of found him to be like a slightly worse Varka that has even more versatility. It's not a one-to-one comparison, but they do have a fair amount of similarities between them. And I am a big fan of both of them, maybe Razor in particular. I don't know, I'm just really happy that he got all these buffs unconditionally and he doesn't need a second hex unit to activate them. I don't know if you guys can tell. Thank you to my channel members: Dorsalfin1 from twitch.tv/Dorsalfin1, Najoro, Rumpaltas, Dadiz, ZaxCDR, Mudkip, Beef Potato, Roberto, Big Soup Buffalo Milk, DB, Bab, Amat, Maho Shoujo Ruru, Smooty, Starnova, Pop Roxy, Tay-Day, Tylee, and Aqua. Thank you so much for your repeated support over all of these months. I very much appreciate you, and thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something. Have a lovely day.